Welcome to another edition of the Early Access Hall of Shame, where I highlight the very special games that take the early access, the crowdfunding, and the indie business models and completely wipe their asses with them. It takes something very special to make it into the Hall of Shame. Just making a lousy game isn't enough. And this one was actually recommended by a viewer who goes by the name of Pissed Off Playthrough, who was kind enough to bring it to my attention. I was only somewhat familiar with the game, having downloaded the demo, played it, then promptly deleting the demo as it sucked really bad. Then I'd pretty much forgotten about it. However, after Pissed Off Playthrough suggested it, I took a second look, and boy does it ever deserve to be in the Hall of Shame. So sit back and witness the abomination known as Towns. Towns launched on Steam Greenlight back in November of 2012. A promising looking title with aspects of all the usual inspirations that games like this draw from. Dwarf Fortress, Dungeon Keeper, etc., etc. And the developers, SMP, promised in their Greenlight campaign that, quote, Towns is currently in a stable and fully playable state, seeing constant updates and additions of new and exciting features with each coming build, end quote. Unfortunately, this was a complete falsehood. Towns was in an alpha state at best. They had been selling it from their website since development began back in 2011, and with the Greenlight approval they had started promising backers that they would receive Steam keys as soon as the game was published. In fact, in the Greenlight comments, the developers readily admit that the game is unfinished, which is the reason given for why the previous backers hadn't gotten Steam keys yet. Apparently, pre-early access Steam only allowed publication of finished games, and they can't give out Steam keys unless the game is actually published. All this, even though on the Greenlight campaign page they promise a game that is, quote, stable and fully playable, end quote. Whatever that might mean. To my innocent mind, I take that to mean that it's mostly finished and free from major bugs, which was obviously not the case for Towns. In fact, serious bugs remain even in its current state. More on this a little later. At this point, this is where the two-man development team began to have their disagreements, and I have to apologize ahead of time if I'm butchering these guys' names. I've only read them, I haven't heard them pronounced. Xavi Canal, hailing from Spain, felt that the game was in good enough state to be called finished and released on Steam for sale. Ben Palgi, living in Israel, disagreed. According to Eurogamer, Palgi said, quote, I had long talks with Xavi about the game's state before launch and how I felt it should be postponed at least until the inclusion of some of the features and the expansion of the existing ones. But the circumstances, and what I can only describe as a blind spot, made him feel as though the game were finished and in a good state to be released through Steam, end quote. And later, quote, because Xavi felt the game was in a good enough state and could be considered as finished on its own, he didn't see it as selling an incomplete game. So there's no question about advertising it as complete, end quote. Alright then. This was all happening about 6 months before Steam launched the Early Access program in March of 2013. What the developers should have done is waited for the Early Access program, but did they even know that Steam would create a program that seemed almost tailor-made for development teams just like them? You know, it's tough to say for sure, but I think there's indication that they knew Early Access was on its way. Again, according to Eurogamer, Ben Palgi said, quote, I would have waited for early access to kick in and take that route. In fact, if we had done that, we would have developed in a far greater positive environment, and perhaps the notion that people pay us so that we could actually put back into developing the game would have been stronger in some of our minds, resulting in a better game even if it took us longer to do so, end quote. To my mind, this implies heavily that they were aware of the imminent early access program, but instead thought that their game was far enough along that they didn't need to use it. Alrighty then. At any rate, they released their game prematurely and in an obviously unfinished state under the label of being, quote, fully playable, end quote. and the predictable avalanche of scorn swept the developers away immediately. They were savaged on Steam's forums because, for some reason, gamers don't like buying obviously unfinished games that have been falsely advertised as being finished. Predictably, the release of their game was a living hell for the two developers as they worked around the clock to try and bring the game up to snuff. Valve apparently got involved, and their typically anemic response merely required that SMP change their store page to state that the game was indeed unfinished. Thanks, Valve. The process was especially arduous for Mr. Canal, as a family member was diagnosed with a serious and potentially fatal disease at this time. So Canal was actually spending time fixing his unfinished game while at the hospital with his loved one. My research wasn't able to uncover the nature of the disease, but to my mind it's largely unimportant. What is important was the eventual outcome, and that was that Canal eventually felt overwhelmed by the avalanche of hate from gamers who had felt misled and, in a move that would make Hello Games proud, took some time off. The result was disastrous, and best put by Canal himself. Quote, "Of course, it was even worse for our reputation, and when I came back there was no way for me to stop that snowball." End quote. As Palgi adds, quote, "The rage was so strong it took us a few weeks, if not a few months, to recover from it. It was extremely hard working under the stress, and our reaction was to mistakenly shut ourselves out from all the drama surrounding the bad launch to try and work on the game in an industrial quietness. This, I believe, caused even more disappointment because it made some of the players think we had took off and ran with the money." Close quote. Despite the bad press and catastrophic launch, the game ended up selling almost 250,000 copies to the tune of around $2 million in gross revenue. So why not just fix the game with the money, you might ask? Well, of course, SMP has a wall of blathering excuses for why $2 million in gross revenue between two developers isn't really much money. For the 4 years of work that went into Towns, that's $250,000 gross a year per developer. Steam takes 30%, of course, which leaves $175,000 per developer per year. They claim that 50% is eaten up in tax, which seems high to me, but they're working in Europe, and I don't know the tax structure very well over there, so I'll take that at face value. But even if they paid 50% tax, that leaves them with $87,500 per developer per year, which is a pretty generous salary, I trust you'll agree. However, I think that, again, the developer's mindset was what stood in the way of Towns actually being finished. According to Palgi, again in Eurogamer, quote, "The question of what happened to the money is a genuinely good question to me and you, but with having the notion that the game was finished and realized, it becomes irrelevant. If you cannot recoup further investment through maintaining sales, and you think the game is finished and in a satisfactory state, you will just not spend money on it to improve something you already think is good enough to begin with." Close quote. So, since the game is good enough to be called playable, it's good enough to not reinvest too much in. Now, being fair, the game has had 6 major patches since release, but it still needs some serious work. Again, more on this a little later. Finally getting fed up, Palgi left SMP in January of 2014 and gave up all the shares he had in the game. The furor finally got too much for Canal, who left in February of 2014. He hired another programmer to work on the game so that he could bow out, but according to Palgi, he was still arguably deluded as to the nature of his own creation. Quote, "Again, from his own perspective, he was hiring someone to work on an already finished, while not perfect, good game." Close quote. Oh, God. The only problem was that the programmer was getting paid on a set percentage of the game's sales, and he was led to believe that the game was selling at more than 3 times the rate that it actually was, and the pay he was receiving wasn't enough to live on, period. End of sentence. So he had to leave the project as well, leaving Towns in its current state. Can't say as I blame him, however. So, how is the game? It's one of the least fun, most annoying experiences I've had while doing this channel, period. For openers, the chances are you'll need to do some work just to get the damn thing to actually run. Remember how I kept saying that the game still has some major issues? Well, one of the big issues is that you might have to erase and reinstall Java to get it to run. I filmed the whole process of my doing this because, well, why not? And once you actually get it running, you'll wish you hadn't. The options are as bare bones as the worst asset flip games I've encountered. The art style is ugly, with the little townspeople looking like twisted little homunculi scurrying around like ants. The animations are few and far between, the graphics are grainy and awful, and it's painfully obvious that no real artist was part of the process of making this appalling game. The notification system is simply terrible. The indicator flashes whenever your people are getting into a fight or can't build something. I found that these notifications and the flashing was way too easy to miss, and the lack of any on-screen animations made the experience of trying to manage my population a ridiculously laborious one. The worst part of the game is the simply awful UI. It's terrible. You have these menus that you flip through to build everything, but it's virtually impossible to see what kind of build hierarchies there are, so it's tough to tell what you need to build first. And you're flipping through these menus constantly just to see what you need. They're not streamlined in the slightest. Building anything is just torture. None of the icons are labeled or any of the menus are labeled, so you're hovering over each one to try and remember what they are. And you have to make zones for each workbench or crafting station before building the actual crafting station. And the minimum size of the zones is always pretty huge compared to the size of the station you're trying to build, so that eats up a lot of precious real estate. The play process is really arduous as a result. For example, you have to put down a carpentry zone before you can build a carpentry workbench, and you have to have a carpentry workbench before building any wood walls. Every person has to have their own room before they'll sleep there, and there's no way to have a dorm for the initial period of the game. No one communally sleeps in towns, apparently. But then again, I was unable to find any sort of status results for my people, so all I know they can exist without eating or sleeping. This one menu along the left side of the screen baffles me. It was mentioned in the tutorial, but the tutorial is so bad that I forgot all of its lessons before I started my first real game. Trying to put a roof on the houses was incredibly bad. I guess you have to use scaffolding or something to get this accomplished, but the ridiculous building system being what it is, I just decided I was done with trying to build houses. And about a half second later, I decided I was done with this horrendous game. I could only play this game for a little less than 45 minutes, and that is an amazingly short time to try and do a video like this. The reason this video took so long to make is that the very thought of playing this game to get footage was depressing, and I did everything I could to avoid it. It is definitely the hardest game I've ever had to do on this channel. It is the worst game I've played on this channel. It's terrible. Do not buy it. Don't even look at it. So, what I'm trying to say here is, the gruesome twosome at SMP are winning the not-so-coveted Hall of Shame award for their hideous dumpster fire of a game, Towns. We love you, SMP. We love you.